I swept that hall for 6 years before anything in it ever answered me. Nobody remembers hiring a sweeper. That's the truth of it. I'd come to the dig as a cook's assistant, half-trained and grateful for the wage. And somewhere in my second month, the foreman noticed I was the only one who didn't complain about the stairs down to the lower levels, and that was that. The cooking went to somebody else, and I got a broom, a headlamp, and a set of keys nobody upstairs particularly wanted. The scholars came and went with their scanners, and their gloves, and their arguments about dialects nobody living could speak. And I came down every morning before any of them were awake. Because the dust in that place didn't care what year it was topside, and somebody had to keep it off the stone. I was 31 when I started down there, and never once thought of it as important work. It was quiet work, which suited me. I liked the hours before the dig woke, when the only sound in the buried complex was my own broom and, somewhere far off, the generators. They called it the Judgment Hall, though nobody could say for certain that was the right word. It sat 40 meters under the excavation scaffolding, cut into rock that predated the rest of the ruin by some number of centuries the surveyors argued about over dinner. A long room, columned, dim even with the lamps strung along the ceiling, and down at the far end, past 600 names carved into the walls in a script only 3 people on the whole dig could half read, there was the altar. Plain stone, waist high, and across it, laid flat like it had been set down a moment ago and not 3,000 years back, a sword. Nobody touched the sword, not because there was a rule against it. There wasn't, not officially, but because the first team that came down here, a decade before I ever set foot in the place, tried. 4 of them, gloved and careful, with a specialist flown in from 3 systems over who'd built his whole career cataloging dead order weaponry. The blade didn't move, didn't glow, didn't do anything at all except sit there being cold stone black metal that took the lamplight and gave none of it back, indifferent as a rock pulled out of a riverbed. The specialist wrote a paper calling it ceremonial and inert, and went home. After that, the excavation office stopped assigning anyone to the altar problem. It became furniture, a very old, very dead, very expensive piece of furniture the funding board liked to photograph for the quarterly reports. I didn't think it was furniture. I couldn't have told you why, not back then. But I had a habit, and I kept it, and I never once mentioned it to the scholars, because I knew exactly how it would sound. Before I swept, I read the names. 611 of them, cut into the walls in that dead script, and I'd learned, slow, over years, from a translator named Bhakti, who used to let me sit in on her sessions if I brought her tea and kept my mouth shut, that they weren't a record of the dead, they were a record of the wronged. Every name on that wall belonged to someone whose grievance was never answered. Someone cheated, someone silenced. Someone who asked for justice from whatever court used to sit in this hall and never got it before the whole order that ran this place came apart and sealed the door behind them. I didn't know most of the words. I knew maybe 40 of the 600 names, sounded out slow and probably wrong, but I said them. Every morning, before I touched a broom to that floor, I stood at the near wall and read what I could, out loud, in a room that never once answered back. It felt wrong to sweep dust over people's grievances like they were nothing. That was the whole habit, 6 minutes a day. I never told anyone. Bhakti caught me at it twice and never said a word about it either, which I've always been grateful for. The morning it happened, I was maybe 30 names in, a Tuesday, ordinary as any other, my knees complaining on the cold floor the way they'd started to those last couple years, when the light in the hall changed. Not brighter, different. A cold thread of it, blue-white, ran up the near edge of the blade, like something had been poured into a groove I'd swept past 1,000 times without ever noticing was there. I stopped mid-name. The thread reached the hilt, and split, running out along channels in the stone altar itself. Lines I would have sworn on my life weren't carved into that surface the day before. I should have run for the surface. I know that. Every protocol we'd been given for the dig said as much. Anomaly, evacuate, report. Instead, I stood there with somebody's 600-year-old grievance half out of my mouth and watched the light climb. By the time Bhakti and the dig lead and two of the surveyors came pounding down the stairs, someone upstairs had a monitor on the chamber, apparently, and it had started screaming numbers nobody understood. The whole altar was lit like a coal bed, and the sword had risen, not lifted by anything I could see, just upright now, hovering a hand's width above the stone, turning, slow, deliberate, the way a man turns to see who's called his name. I heard the dig lead say my name once, sharp, like a question, and then not say anything else. The surveyors had gone still by the doorway, the kind of still that isn't calm so much as the body deciding on its own not to move. Bhakti's grip on my arm never loosened, but she didn't pull me back either. I think some part of her understood, faster than the rest of us, that whatever this was, it wasn't finished, and it wasn't going to be stopped by 4 people backing toward the stairs. The light kept climbing the grooves in the stone, patient, unhurried, as if it had all the time left in the world, and had simply chosen, after 3,000 years of none of it mattering, to spend a little of it now. It was turning toward me. Bhakti grabbed my arm. I remember that clearly, her nails, the cold of the floor coming up through my knees, the surveyor's lights swinging wild across the columns. Nobody said anything. There wasn't anything worth saying. We had all spent years being told this room was dead furniture, and dead furniture doesn't turn. The blade stopped when it faced me square. The light along its edge banked down from white to something closer to embers, steady, waiting. And then it spoke. Not a voice out of the air the way I'd have expected, but out of the metal itself, low, like a bell struck once and let ring. The wrong remembers. That was all. 3 words, if you don't count the article. I've turned them over 10,000 times since, and I still don't have a better way to explain what came after them than to tell you plainly. Something in that room recognized me, the way you'd recognize a face you'd been waiting a long time to see again, and it had absolutely nothing to do with my name, or my family, or anything I'd ever been given. It had to do with what I did with 6 free minutes every morning that nobody was paying me to spend. Bhakti told me later, she'd worked out enough of the dead script by then to be sure, that the order who built this hall had one law above every other. A wrong left unnamed was a wrong left to happen again. Their whole court, their whole reason for existing, was built on the discipline of saying the names out loud so the dust never got to bury them a second time. It was the one thing they asked of whoever sat as their bearer of judgment. Not lineage, not blood, no test of strength or cleverness, none of the things I'd have guessed, back when I still thought about it at all. An old order would demand of the one it finally chose. Just the willingness to keep saying the names when nobody was listening, and no one was going to reward you for it, morning after morning, for as long as it took. I'd been doing it for 6 years for no reason I could have defended to a review board. I couldn't tell you, honestly, when the habit had turned from something I did, because it felt wrong not to, into something I simply was. Bhakti says that's usually how it goes with the things that end up mattering most. They don't announce themselves while you're doing them. They just accumulate, quietly, until something very old decides to notice. The sword didn't come to my hand that morning. It didn't need to. It settled back onto the altar, the light banking down to a low, patient glow along the fuller, and it has stayed lit ever since. The first time in 3,000 years anyone on that dig had seen it hold any light at all overnight. The scholars have theories now, committees, a dozen new grant proposals built around sustained anomalous activation. Bhakti still lets me sit in on her sessions. I still sweep that hall every morning. I still read the names first, same as always, 6 minutes, out loud, before the broom ever touches the floor. The only thing that's changed is that now, when I finish, the light along the blade dims half a shade, like something settling back to rest, satisfied that the account is still being kept. Nobody assigned me that duty. Nobody ever will need to. I've come to understand that's rather the point of it.